Chapter 3, Creating Anglo-America, is going to continue our look into Period 2, which is mostly about the establishment of the English colonies and how they developed leading up to the American Revolution. So here we're going to look at how the English Empire in America expanded in the mid-17th century, how slavery was established in these English colonies and the effect of that. We'll look at some other social and political crises in the late 17th century, and we will look at directions of social and economic change, as well as patterns of class and gender roles. So really what we're looking at here is how the colonies go from being fledgling settlements in the Chesapeake and in New England to being much more established societies that are essentially the societies that we are going to see leading up to the American Revolution in a few decades. So the first question was, how did the English Empire in America expand in the mid-17th century? First of all, the English colonies made use of an economic system called mercantilism. Mercantilism held that the government should regulate economic activity in order to promote national power. It relies on very strict control of trade, where a colonizing country, or the mother country, in this case England, is going to demand raw materials from a colony that they will import, manufacture into something, and then ship back for sale in the colony. It's going to try to keep everything within a kind of closed loop so that they really don't have to import much from other countries, and any surplus they can sell to other countries. An example of this mercantilistic system for the North American English colonies were the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts reflect this very strict control of trade by specifying certain goods that they called enumerated goods that could only be shipped to England. Things like sugar, things like tobacco. Here's the thing though, they were very poorly enforced, and that was kind of an intentional policy to, in a certain sense, keep the colonists happy. This is going to be part of something we'll later on refer to as salutary neglect. But it's important to understand that theoretically, the colonies are within this mercantilistic system that strictly controls trade through the Navigation Acts, but in practice it's pretty poorly enforced, and the colonists are going to get quite used to this over the decades. Next, the Carolinas, down further south, were founded later on as a kind of barrier to Spanish expansion out of Spanish Florida. These colonies would grow to become agricultural slave societies centered around the cultivation of rice. So worth noting here really quickly is the cash crops of this era in the American South are things like tobacco, rice, indigo, but one crop you don't see yet is cotton. And even though we associate the American South and American slavery with cotton, that's not going to be introduced as a major cash crop until into the 1800s, after the United States has, or excuse me, after the colonies have become the United States of America. So we'll come back to that, but just important to note for right now. Another new colony established is the Pennsylvania colony. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn. It was, at least in part, serving as a kind of refuge for a religious group called the Quakers, who were pacifist, who were religiously tolerant, and the colony very much reflected that. The colony of Pennsylvania established religious liberty, an elected assembly, so sort of semi-democratic governance, and broad suffrage, or right to vote. So the right to vote was not limited by religion or land ownership, but was much, much broader. They also, notably, had a much more positive relationship with their Native American neighbors, because as the colony is mostly Quakers at first, who are all pacifists, I mean, they don't fight, they had to have good relationships with their neighbors. They could not antagonize them as other English colonists could or did, because they would not have the means to defend themselves. Secondly, how slavery was established in the Western Atlantic world. So African slaves are going to offer certain advantages for white slavers over Native American slaves, which is generally unsuccessful, and indentured servants. These so-called advantages are, first of all, slavery would be perpetual. Unlike indentured servitude, it would not be temporary coerced labor, but lifelong coerced labor that would be passed on to your children. Um, so this avoided creating that large class of landless poor of former indentured servants. Um, and also another advantage was that slavery was, in this sense, or in this case, racial. It was associated with slavery was associated with blackness, making it harder to escape, making it easier to establish strict social hierarchies and divisions, and aiding in the oppression of this coerced labor force. Um, Another so-called advantage is that Africans were accustomed to Western diseases in a way that Native Americans were not. They had a natural immunity to it. They could still get sick, but like Europeans, they tended not to die from things like smallpox or influenza, certainly not at the rate that Native Americans did. In the Chesapeake, where slavery was originally established, the status of African Americans was pretty ambiguous in early days. Historians are not sure if they were treated as slaves in a more familiar modern sense that we might know, or if they were treated more like indentured servants. They're not really sure. However, we definitely know that Africans were legally defined as slaves by the 1660s. And at that, in the Chesapeake, they begin this practice of defining anyone of any African ancestry as being black and thus a slave. And that kind of incentivizes a white slaver or a white landowner who enslaves people to rape their slaves, because even though that would be their child, they would be half black in a certain sense, and thus they would automatically be defined as slaves. So the sexual abuse of slaves was incredibly common, and the law, through this idea that any amount of blackness meant slavery, the law really kind of encouraged that kind of sexual abuse and exploitation of slaves. Um, the Chesapeake is where we're going to see the transition firmly from indentured servitude as the chief labor force to slavery as the chief labor force. And this is going to happen due to an event called Bacon's Rebellion. It's going to accelerate this shift from white indentured servitude to African slaves. It begins with poor former indentured servants that were living on the frontier, who were coming into constant conflict with Native Americans whose land they were stealing, when they demanded the removal of these local Native American tribes so that they could settle more land. When Virginia's governor denied them this assistance and this removal, a rebellion broke out on the colonial government itself. It's going to be led by a man named Nathaniel Bacon, who himself was actually wealthy, but most of his supporters were poor former indentured servants. Um, Many were white, but some were also black joining in this rebellion. So this was very much a class rebellion of the poor against the rich, and it's exposing these long simmering tensions between this large class of landless poor and a very small class of coastal wealthy elites. Um, Bacon's rebellion will eventually be put down, but these tensions that were clearly exposed here between rich and poor led to reforms that expanded the rights and status of whites and relied more on African slave labor than indentured servitude. This way, they could stem the growth of the landless poor population, uh, and create a permanent underclass of coerced labor. And they would socially elevate whites through things like new privileges. So, like, for example, by 1700, every county in Virginia had white militias that were designed to protect against Native Americans or insurrection of slaves. Neither of these things were a huge risk by 1700, but by granting this sort of job title, by granting this sort of power to poor whites, it helped to elevate them above this permanent underclass of black slaves. So, in sum, or in short, the effect of Bacon's rebellion is that wealthy landowners are going to reevaluate their use of indentured servants, and they're going to shift toward the use of slaves instead. This way, they're not continuing to grow this class of landless poor that might rise up against them. They're creating a coerced labor force that will constantly be the bottom rung of society and separating their society not based on wealth as it had been, but now separating it based on race. And that was beneficial for the wealthy. Third question, what major social and political crises rocked the colonies in the late 17th century? The first big one to know is King Philip's War, which happened in 1675. This was led by a Native American named Metacom, who the English called King Philip. And Metacom led an alliance of tribes that tried to drive out New England colonists. It was motivated, so this is a political and military rebellion, but it's also a religious and cultural one too, because along with these military efforts to expel English colonists, there were also efforts to purify themselves of the negative influences of white culture. And this is kind of a pattern in large Native American uprisings against whites, colonists, and then Americans later on that we will see throughout American history is that it is part military and political and is also part religious and cultural. Um, in the end, of course, King Philip's War is unsuccessful in their goal of driving out all English colonists. However, it was incredibly deadly and resulted in the death of about 30% of the population of New England. So that's nearly 1 in 3 New Englanders are dead at the conclusion of King Philip's War. This has a couple of effects. One, this is definitively the end of large-scale Native American resistance in New England because really after this, Native American tribes who had allied themselves behind Metacom have been destroyed to the extent that they can no longer mount effective resistance. Secondly, the brutality and death toll of King Philip's War is going to firmly entrench the negative stereotype or negative image of Native Americans as bloodthirsty savages for many white colonists, and that idea is effectively going to stick. Another political crisis is the so-called Glorious Revolution in 1688. We're not going to worry about the details too much here. All right, but suffice to say, this was a bloodless coup in England that overthrew the king, King James II. Why this matters for the colonies is that King James II, when he was still ruling, had combined the various colonies in New England into a kind of super colony called the Dominion of New England. And the intent here was to place these colonies under more direct royal control and to reduce their autonomy, reduce their independence, put them more firmly under the grip of the English crown. This is also kind of a response in King James' view to the vulnerability of a devastated New England after King Philip's War, the idea being that stern royal control could provide stability in the aftermath of this war. Colonists in New England are not a fan of the Dominion of New England or its royal governor, Sir Edmund Andros. And when King James II was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution, Colonists here took advantage of that, and revolts broke out in the name of quote unquote traditional English liberties. So they overthrow the royal governor Edmund Andros, they restore their colonial charters for the most part, and this is almost a kind of preview for the American Revolution. The colonists here believe that their traditional English liberties, or their rights, are being violated by their government. And that, in their view, permits them to overthrow their government and establish one that does protect their rights. We'll come back to this pattern again a couple of times, and it's important, but we're already seeing a kind of preview or shadows of the coming revolution in a few decades. Final crisis here is the Salem witchcraft crisis, and this is going to have profound effects in New England. So keep in mind the context here, and that is witchcraft was widely believed in at the time among the English colonists and mainland England alike, and it was widely blamed for misfortune. It was also misogynistic in the sense that witches were overwhelmingly considered to be women, and they thus challenged God's will and the standing of men in society. They challenged God's will by practicing magic in opposition to God's natural law, and then they challenged men's standing in a patriarchal society as being independent and powerful women. Of course, this was all hysteria, and there were no witches, of course, but this hysteria in Salem resulted ultimately in the execution of 20 people. Ultimately, these trials of these witches, or of these so-called alleged witches, is going to weaken Puritan religious authority in colonial government, because it's going to discredit Puritan anti-witch traditions as these trials and accusations are revealed to be the sham that they are. And authorities are going to increasingly seek scientific rather than supernatural explanations for natural events. So the Salem witchcraft crisis is central to New England's transition away from theocracy to a more secular form or non-religious form of government. Right. Fourth, what were the directions of social and economic change in the 18th century colonies? First of all, the population of these colonies diversified. We have Scottish, Scotch-Irish, and German immigration into the colonies, and they will bring with them various forms of religion. So that's going to result in more religious diversity, and thus kind of de facto religious toleration. It's not written into the law yet, but most people are becoming just inherently more religiously tolerant as a result of the fact of religious diversity there. Next, Native Americans who bordered the colonies had changed dramatically by the mid-1700s. They had been ravaged by diseases. They had become independent on European trade goods, and some of which, like alcohol and firearms, actually helped in the destruction of these cultures. Next, distinct regions developed by the mid-1700s, and this map doesn't exactly reflect it the way that I would like, but you've got three main regions. The first is New England. So furthest north in the yellow there is New England. They are mostly small farms. They are mostly based on agriculture and commerce or trade of the Atlantic. The second region, there in pink, like Pennsylvania and New York, these are the middle colonies. They are centered around commerce and cereal crops like wheat. Finally, we have the South, and that's a combination of, the lower South there, further south in blue or purple, whatever the heck that is, and then the Chesapeake colonies in the upper South in green, like Virginia and Maryland. Those two combined colors on this map constitute the region of the South. And the South is centered around cash crops and the use of slave labor. Finally, the colonies by the mid-1700s had grown economically to become a key part of Atlantic trade. They were central to the so-called triangular trade across the Atlantic, whereby manufactured goods were sold from Europe to purchase slaves in Africa, which were used, and these slaves were used to produce raw materials in the Americas, which were then shipped to Europe to be manufactured into manufactured goods to be sold for slaves in Africa, and on and on and on and on. Keep in mind the Navigation Acts are theoretically controlling what goods the English colonists in North America can export and who they can sell them to. However, remember, in practice, this is pretty poorly enforced. So although things like sugar and tobacco are enumerated goods that are only supposed to be sold to England, you've got plenty of traders in New England that are essentially smuggling by selling to the French or selling to the Spanish or the Dutch or someone else. But they're effectively allowed to get away with it because of the lax enforcement of the Navigation Acts. Number 5, how did patterns of class and gender roles change in 18th century America? So a wealthy elite had developed throughout the colonies that controlled colonial politics and society. In the South, these were wealthy planters or plantation owners that grew cash crops and owned a lot of slaves. And in the middle colonies in New England, this elite were wealthy merchants that were traders or sold from the coast. They were not an aristocracy, though. So even though we have a class of very wealthy people controlling politics and society in the colonies, they're not an aristocracy per se, because we didn't have one in the colonies, and we won't have one in America, because an aristocracy has people that have titles like baron, duke, earl, and they have different privileges under the law that even very wealthy people who are not aristocrats don't have. So yes, there is a very small, very wealthy elite class that controls most of, the colonial happenings. They're not an aristocracy per se, and that's a tradition that's going to hold even after the Revolution. In contrast to this very small, wealthy elite, the poor continue to be a growing population, and a wealth gap between the poor and the rich continues to be a problem. About half of all colonial wealth, so of all the money held by all the people in the colonies, about half of that was concentrated or owned by the top 10% of colonists. And that is an incredible wealth gap. Keep in mind that slaves are also included in this definition of the poor, but even excluding that idea and how that might alter the numbers somewhat, this is an enormous wealth gap, the likes of which we're not going to see again for a while, and that many of the founders of the country are actually actively going to fight against after the revolution has occurred. Worth noting, I'm making a lot out of this huge gap between the rich and the poor. There is a middle class. It's small. It's small like it would be in any European society at this time. However, the colonies did have a larger middle class than England had, and it had a larger middle class than most European countries at all had. So there was a sense of greater social mobility in the colonies, despite this kind of wealth gap that I've harped on an awful lot. Finally, as colonial society became more complex, it became more patriarchal or male dominated, and that is usually the case. That as societies become more complex, they tend to become more patriarchal. Women were increasingly expected to devote their lives to being wives and mothers. And they also lost control of their property when they were married. They would have no legal identity apart from their husbands. They couldn't testify in court. They couldn't serve on juries. They couldn't vote. They couldn't serve an elected office. So women were, to be generous, second-class citizens, but more accurate, they were probably, again, non-citizens altogether. And this is going to be a trend for women throughout the colonial era and even into the early national period. And that'll be something that we concentrate on quite a bit moving forward. But for now, with the conclusion of chapter 3, you should hopefully have a pretty good idea of what the English colonies looked like on the eve of the American Revolution. In the next chapter, we will look at some further developments just prior to the Revolution and also examine the definitions of freedom at this time of the English colonies, certainly as it pertains to the roughly 20% of the population who are enslaved.